Hello, I'm Dr. Karen Hiltz, and I want to welcome you to the Apple Report. This week we're going to talk about legislation. We ended last week with state constitutions and how the state constitution is the foundation for the education opportunities or programs within each state. And the legislature is the next logical discussion point, as far as I'm concerned, with regards to understanding what programs are in each state and what is allowed. Now, each state has a legislative body. It's either a General Assembly, a state legislature, maybe a state Congress, but they have a House and a Senate, and they will create, propose, debate, and vote on bills. Now, if the bills pass, they go to the governor for signature, and if the governor signs, then that's where our laws come from. Well, with regards to the state legislatures, I want to state that they don't typically create or write the bills. The bills, their staff works on them, and then there are external entities that work on them, writing them as well, and those are lobbyists and special interest groups. And so from that perspective, you can see that a lot of legislation is either topic, issue, or agenda driven. And the legislators actually sponsor bills. And with that said, the majority party usually has the upper hand with regards to what bills get passed and go to the governor's desk and which ones don't. Now, that's not always the case, but when it comes to education, that is common or typical, I'll say, depending on the state legislature, obviously. Well, also with regards to legislation, one thing I want to highlight is there are always, and I mean always, unintended consequences to legislation, because what benefits one group or segment of the population is not necessarily a benefit to the other group or segment of the population. And so that's where I want to talk about the legislative cycle. In my opinion, I don't think legislative cycles are sufficient to do what they're intended to do and to minimize unintended consequences. States typically will have their annual session will be 45, 60, 90 days. And if you're talking about 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 bills, I don't believe that that's enough time to adequately discuss and understand bills that are coming before them and really understand and minimize unintended consequences. So that's one of my issues I have with regards to legislation. But also the other element that I wanted to talk about with regards to legislation is the hierarchy. As I said, the Constitution is the foundation, and then you have the legislation that gets passed and becomes law. Well, that legislation is usually kind of what I would refer to as an umbrella, or it's written broadly because there needs to be some flexibility usually with regards to that. But also, the one unintended consequence of that is that it's up to interpretation. So that's where litigation comes into play. But that's for another session. But anyway, the legislation itself is written from a less specific element, I'll say, a less specific language. Then out of that legislation comes policy, and how I like to define policy is that policy gives direction and more specificity with regards to the legislation that became law. And out of that policy comes regulation, which gives more specificity, and it also provides more of a handbook or where the rubber meets the road. This is how we're going to implement this program into our system. So there again, let's circle back around in that there's the Constitution, then there is legislation, and then there's policy, and then there's regulation. And with each element of those levels, there becomes more specificity to provide more clarity. The intent is to provide more clarity to implement programs and use of funds and things of that nature. So I want to talk about Arizona, Ohio, and Virginia. I mentioned those in the previous video, and I want to talk about some of the education programs that they have in their states and how they tie back to the legislation and what their constitution allows or doesn't allow. So I look forward to speaking with you next week, and I hope you will like and share, and please give me feedback. Thank you.